Hello? Sorry. Hey, so I'm Chanda. I run engineering at StrongLoop, which is now, as you all know, an IBM company. So first off, I want to ask you guys, how many people in this room are managers? Oh, quite a few. Okay, cool. So I was kind of thinking that, they perhaps put me in the wrong room because this room is so big, and, I was convinced that you guys are all going to be developers and wondering what the heck am I talking about. So anyways, when we started to put together our list of talk submissions for Node Interactive, someone suggested I should talk about, building and engaging high-performance teams, because we certainly did a really good job of that at StrongLoop. And I was like, duh, why would anybody want to build a low-performance team? But then when I started to put down, seriously, right? So I started to put down on a piece of paper, what are the nuances of, a high-performance team, and what that means for open source and what that means for Node.js. And actually, it ended up being quite interesting, at least, I like what we did at StrongLoop. So I'm going to tell you about StrongLoop and how we ran engineering at StrongLoop, and what are some of the takeaways. And, let's go from there. So clearly, a high-performance team is a challenge. Why would anybody in their right mind want to, on a day-to-day basis, sort of push hands with these really high-performing, strongly opinionated, sometimes very argumentative engineers, right? So there are a few very key things that actually a high-performance team can do for you. One is obviously, immense gain in productivity, very high-quality code, and of course, a faster time to market. These are all standard and vanilla, right? But you got to remember, what does quality of code mean, right? A high-performance team can actually write really good quality code, and what that means is you have less issues coming back in production, which means we at StrongLoop actually got away with a very, very slim QA team, because the code going out was really good. There have been studies actually in the past, these are very well-known studies that tell you that the cost of fixing bugs on your dev box is $1, whereas the cost of fixing bugs on staging is $10, and the cost of fixing bugs in production can actually range from $1,000 to $10,000, depending on the scale of the company. And we are at a very big scale in our company now. So it's really important to make sure that the quality of the, your team is top-notch, right? So as you can see in StrongLoop, over a period of 3 years, it's actually 2.5 or 2 3/4 of years, with 10 developers, we've produced tons and tons of code, 150 plus repos, really. I think it's more than 200 now, like I stopped counting. And it's over a wide and varied suite of products that came out of StrongLoop. So productivity and quality code actually are really, really key. So when you talk about anything, really, there are three dimensions that you consider, right? Similarly, for high-performance teams, there are three things that you want to think about: the people, the process, and the technology, right? In each of these three dimensions, actually, there's one key element that is important. One, A, being that the top-notch people that you have, and an evolving process, because you cannot come in with a formula and expect that that same formula is going to work everywhere, right? So you have to have an evolving process for this. And technology, clearly, you are working in open source. You're working in Node.js, which is very new. Very soon, we're not going to say it's new anymore, because it's been around since 2009. But essentially, don't waste time trying to do everything from scratch. It's basically, look what's out there, beg, borrow, do it quick, right, on your own. So the essence of StrongLoop always has been, develop fast, throw it out there, and see what sticks. See what the market wants, fail fast. Change, iterate again, throw it out there, modify what you want. And this applies for marketing. It also applies for engineering. So continuing on along the people dimension, a lot has been already said about hiring. I myself have written a blog previously about hiring for the Node.js stack. So I won't say much here, but it's very, very clear to me over the last 3 years after working with the development team that I have, that it's less about Node, it's less about the language in which you develop or the paradigm in which you develop, but it's more about principles of software development, right? You want to make sure that you have the really top-notch team. You are able to hire and bring in a team that can understand scale, can understand performance, can understand reuse, and are excellent at debugging. I mean, that's one of the key things, one key takeaway is that you have to be able to debug whatever paradigm that you're working in. And clearly, Node has been a shift from your traditional Java paradigm, right? You want developers that are capable of, design thinking, are passionate about, test-driven development, and, are passionate about code hygiene, and do a really good job on, modular programming, because Node, as you know, is it's all about writing small modules and, plugging them all together. Right? The Strong Loop development team actually ranges from people who have been steeped in Java for more than a decade to C, C++, Python, you name it. There are many of our developers at Strong Loop actually came in not really experts as in Node.js, but very quickly picked up. And the reason they were able to very quickly pick up and move fast on this is because inherently they were great software developers. So I'm really proud of the team that we have. So that's all I want to say about hiring. You can go to meetups and look for people, but that's another story altogether. The next thing I want to talk about is the nature of your team. And if there's one thing at the end of this talk I want you guys to go over with is with the word fungible, right? And there's a lot of talk about what fungible means in my team, because fungible really is it's really, if you look up at the dictionary definition, fungibility is a property of a commodity whose units can be interchanged. Now, some developers get all prickly about it, right? Like, what do you mean? Am I replaceable? Does it mean that you can just take me and put somebody else there and you have the same thing going on? But really, it's not. Fungibility is really about equivalence in the goodness of things. It's not liquidity. You cannot, for example, take your heavy systems backend developer and have them turn out like beautiful interactive IDE Angular code, right? You cannot take a front-end developer and then suddenly have them work in deep layers of your stack. But what it means is, you should be a full-stack developer to work in the Node.js, an open source stack. You should be able to at least, a systems developer, for example, should be able to go and be able to debug and at least identify any burning issue, whether it is in the Angular portion of your stack or in the Node.js portion of your stack, or deep down in your C, C++ layers. Similarly for your front-end developer. If they're able to debug all the way down to the Node stack, then it's easy for them to identify where the issue lies and hand it off to the right person / team. So that is one way I define fungibility, right? It is basically the equivalence of goodness. Fungibility actually has other dimensions as well besides stack. Fungibility simply means in the life of a startup, you really should be prepared to do whatever it takes to take that startup to the next stage, right? So because you're a developer doesn't mean you cannot evangelize. Because you're a developer doesn't mean that you cannot write a blog. And in fact, Strong Loop has actually produced most amount of blogs. At one point, we used to joke that if we didn't succeed, heavily, you would at least be known for the company that wrote the most blogs. Blogs are one example, but they do give you a lot of attention. They actually, in the open source community, the blogs are very valuable because you're writing about not only the products that you're developing in a marketing sort of way, but you're also explaining how to use them. You are writing about the challenges you faced and problems that you solved. So fungibility basically, in my mind, also means being able to work at all levels of a particular startup. So while there are examples out there where fungibility is, people compare commodities like currency and crude oil. I would say look at fungibility as when you think about gold. Gold is a fungible unit, right? Your developers are your gold. You can actually take gold and you can exchange it for other pieces of gold, and it's the equal value. So think about it, think about fungibility in those positive terms and not crude oil. The other key dimension of this whole business is, of course, the nature of open source itself, right? Some of the challenges are around, understanding the open source culture, the passion that people have for developing code. The whole open source community is very diverse, as the Uber speaker actually alluded to. It is diverse not only in terms of the backgrounds that people come from, but it's also diverse in terms of, there are hobbyists. I've seen a lot of hobbyists in the Node.js community, right? They do develop and they create useful modules just as a hobby on the side. There are also enterprise developers, that are paid to produce code. But most 90% of the time, not only do people do this by choice, but they also do it with feedback from community. It's in collaboration with community that open source development, open source modules are created. So people are coming from various diverse geographic locations. This we found to be very true, actually. In Strong Loop, we did not restrict ourselves to a specific geographic location. We went where the best were to be found. So my team in Strong Loop actually ranged from all the way from Amsterdam, Ben and Bert, as you guys know. We have people in Prague, we have people in Vancouver, and we have people in San Mateo. Some of this has been actually really a valuable lesson in terms of how to work with a team that is stretched across so many geographic boundaries, right? And I'll talk about that in terms of tooling a little bit. The other important thing to remember about open source development is to understand that the community feedback is actually really important. Paying immediate attention to pull requests or any comments and reviews that you get on code that you write. And even in terms of product development and feature development, paying attention to the upvotes that you get for what you proposed as a public roadmap out there, right? So it's really important to pay attention to these features. And then the other thing is, so I'm going to say this in a delicate way. So in enterprise, many times there's a lot of, there are a lot of barriers to being able to, fix code that is not part of your company's ecosystem. But as an open source team, you really need to understand that sometimes fixing a bug in a third-party dependency, not only does it benefit you, your code, but it benefits the community, and then because of that, it benefits the company that you work for as a whole, because you're seen as a positive force in the open source module ecosystem. So I just want to say that that's actually really important to pay attention to as you build a large team in the open source world. So process and team is another thing, right? I mean, there's been a lot of work and a lot of interesting process work actually done on team structures, and how things are, how things should be structured so that you get the best optimal productivity, right? I found this funny picture I didn't create this, but there's a very well-known funny image of team and team structures where, you have the model where there's centralized control, right? Not naming any names, but they're out there. I didn't create the picture. There's a centralized control model, there's the cannibalistic model, and there's, then there's the interesting Facebook node graph, which, I don't know what it really means. I mean, who's responsible for what, right? But it works, right? I mean, so every company and every startup has to find their own way of making the structure work. That's actually my 3 years of lessons from Strong Loop is, don't assume what works for somebody is going to work for you. Understand your team, understand the nature of your development stack, and understand what you need to do in order to make that team the best team that has ever existed. So I did this myself, actually. I don't develop anymore, but I'm fascinated by process and productivity improvement. So I sat down and we did several experiments. I looked at Spotify, I looked at the Google War Room approach, and several other things that are out there. Spotify has this very interesting approach of squads and villages and tribes, and it's all very fascinating, but it's sort of I couldn't really relate to it. Because, I mean, we have 10 developers, we'll probably end up having a squad of 2. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? So we had to try something else. So in Strong Loop, what we did was we borrowed from the West, is what I like to say. War rooms are great because you're in one room and you can have everybody who's working on the product sitting in that one room. There was a startup I worked at previously where we went out to Home Depot and bought 4 sheets of plywood that we stuck on a wall. That was our Scrum board, right? So whatever it takes to work. So at StrongLoop, what really worked for us actually is forming feature groups that were sort of loosely formed, in the moment, so to speak, meaning that you had a product feature that was going to go out, and we formed a feature group which had one UI front-end developer, you had one back-end developer, you had a middleware, and you had a tech lead and a QA, right? Now many of these people, so I'm counting off 4 people already, What's left for the rest of the company is 4 other people. So it's not, so it doesn't, rest of the product doesn't stop development, correct? So it's almost like each of the people in the feature group actually almost like have a day job for the rest of StrongLoop, and their feature job for production of that particular feature until that feature gets out the door. And that's the experiment we tried latest, and it seems to have worked very well. Not sure how it can scale. The only way it can scale is to kind of 100% solidify feature groups, but then that goes against the grain of a startup and how you want to quickly move in an agile fashion. So feature groups is an experiment at StrongLoop that worked very well. The other thing is, of course, tooling. Tooling is really important. So when you have the small Scrum teams, 7 to 10 people max. I mean, the whole company is 10 people. So we had like about 3 to 4 people in a Scrum team. And we changed our Scrum teams and our Scrum leads also pretty often. But the one important thing that always is important is to make sure that you have continuous improvement and kind of a check-in for everything you do. People, process, technology, like I said before, right? You have to be able to, data is king, obviously, so you have to be able to measure. You have to be able to, in order that you can allocate and kind of have some reasonable amount of predictability that you can pass on to your product team and your marketing people and market out there, professional services people who always want the next cutting edge feature without tracking, and he walks in the door just as I'm talking about him. So in order to be able to inform your professional services team about what's coming next, you have to be able to have some reasonable amount of estimation and allocation so you can give a high level idea of what's coming down the pipe. The one thing that is important here to remember is that tooling is really critical. Earlier, we started with Jira. And while I liked Jira quite a bit because it has all these nice, pretty dashboards and charts that can give me burn ups and burn downs, and it can tell me where my milestone is and how many things are left in the milestone. It shows me red where the bugs are. It was just useless for the developers because once again, remember we are talking about the node stack, and in the node stack, it's everybody's on GitHub. And GitHub has no tooling that can do anything for project management as far as I know so far, right? So we looked and we made a major switch from Jira to Waffle. And I'm not saying that Waffle is like the best there is. There are quite a few other things as well, but we've used Waffle so far. And the developers are absolutely in love with it because they can stay in their GitHub world and they can come to stand up and look at Waffle, and they didn't have to move anything, right? They didn't have to do any extra level of markup somewhere so a manager knows what's going on, right? Everything happens in the GitHub issue. A PR is submitted, it's merged, it's closed, it moves across the board, and your project management knows what's going on. So that's beautiful. The disadvantage is that Waffle doesn't really do reporting very well. There's no burn up, burn down. There's no keeping track of what got added into your Scrum because it's largely a Kanban-ish approach, which doesn't necessarily work very well for predictability and estimation, in my opinion. So there is a lot of need for improvement, and I think there's stuff out there in the last 6 months that has improved quite a bit, and we have to look to see what we can do there. In the case of StrongLoop, we wrote our own tooling. So we wrote our own little script that kind of stuck labels across all our 150 repos. I mean, Waffle works very well for 1 repo, 2 repos, 5 repos. But when you have 150 source repos, I mean, the thing really chugs. So if any of you guys are thinking of startup ideas, specifically target towards GitHub and Node.js, take a look at project management tooling. We really need it. I have 1 minute. That's it. Okay. So you should get me outside because I have a lot to talk about. One of the more important things to remember is that we are talking about a diverse community. We are talking about developers who reside in all parts of the world. And one model is that everybody's co-located and you have teams that are co-located, which is fantastic. And if you can do that, that's great. But it didn't work for Strong Loop, obviously, right? Because we went to where the best were, like I said. So we had to work a lot on how can we have the best engagement with our developers, right? So we tried a variety of things. And some of the top things we have tried and been successful at are Slack, Google Hangouts, any Hangouts for anything. I think video is very critical in order that you have that, eye contact. It's like the next best thing to eye contact. In our case, actually, there have been cases where developers have come together at, company retreats, and they're talking to, so Sam's talking to Joe, and, they're having a conversation, and Sam realizes he's never ever met Joe in physical person before. And that's because they've been in meetings, they've been in Hangouts, they've been in daily stand-ups where they can see each other. And it doesn't feel like you didn't know this person until, the first time you met them was 3 months after they had joined the company. So I think it's very important to have communication as the key tool. We use Slack even for integrating a lot of our, failure reports and coverage reports and all kinds of things from our build and release tools. And the other thing is, communicate, communicate, and communicate. Excessive communication is always open, and excessive communication has been the key to Strong Loop. It's sometimes very much an overload, but there's pros and cons of everything, right? One of the things that is a culture of Strong Loop, that has been the culture of Strong Loop, which probably will not scale, but we'll probably keep some of it, which is a face-to-face event that we used to have every quarter, and that involved flying the entire company over, the 20 people that we had into one location, spending 3 days and nights working together, whiteboarding things, and actually cooking together, which was actually quite fun. So, in a startup, that's actually really important that you really know the people. These are not just some names on a board. Tooling follows the same high-performance pattern as your team does. Continuously improve it, try things. Write small tools. Our build and release tooling is actually pretty excellent. We generate a lot of failure reports that are integrated into Slack, like I said. It also generates change logs, which we can use, or people who are out on the field can look at to know what's in the release and are well informed about things that are fixed. And what else can I tell you here? I'm kind of skipped through the last parts fast because I thought only I had a minute. But going back, basically to summarize, I wanted to point out that in hiring for a high-performing team, hire smart. Don't make any shortcuts there. It's actually really important because one excellent developer actually can do the work of 5 others, right? Make sure to pay attention to community feedback because this is open source and people are looking at your code, using your code, and they are as passionate about using your code as you are about developing it, right? And fungibility, if anybody tells you is crude oil is not crude oil, it is gold. So, you make sure that you and your team are fungible, flexible, adaptable in many dimensions when you are at a startup that's racing to success. And then, of course, modern communication tools are always the key. There's a lot out there. Experiment, measure, tweak, and fail fast. That's the way forward for high-performance teams in this open source community. If you have any questions, since I finished early. Yes?
In terms of communications, you mentioned Slack. Do you have any privacy concerns with the data that might be flowing between you and others as a team and your organization? Do you want to protect your intellectual assets?
We did not. I mean, really, this is open source. The only privacy concerns that might be if we were talking about, I don't even know what we would be talking about that would be on Slack, right? I mean, we had private channels for certain members of the team, and we were in discussions about, certain things, but there wasn't really. I mean, our whole philosophy at Strong Loop has been open communication. Yeah, that is a concern for larger enterprise, and there are ways to go around that, right? I mean, IBM is actually doing a lot in this area. IBM is experimenting a lot with Slack. It's turning around, actually. So. Could you?
If I was turning Intel, so if I was talking with peers about using the top code names, I wouldn't want them data mining my information.
I see.
In my private
I see, I see. Yeah, so yeah, you gotta think about that a little bit. You're talking about internal communication though, right? You can host it internally and you can, have paid access to Slack and you can secure it. Yeah, yeah. Thank you.